So we'll talk about how our product evolved in 3 main steps. We'll talk about, more even importantly, about kind of like the mistakes we've made, which I believe as a early stage startup is kind of like the most important thing that we're doing, learning from our mistakes. So we'll talk about that. Before going into the 3 stages, I'll kind of give like this high-level overview about the problem and what we do, and then we'll get into the stages themselves. So where we actually started off was that when we founded the company, myself, Nadav, my co-founder, he's also here, and our third co-founder, we went and talked to hundreds of data executive data teams, and we asked them all the same question. We asked them, what is your number 1 problem in your daily tasks? And what we heard over and over again, actually out of 85% of the companies that we talked to, they said that the problem that I'm going to show you right now is their number 1 problem. And we've heard it from one of the data analysts that we've talked to, Maya. She is a data analyst in a decentralized product team in a mid-enterprise. And she told us the following story. So she said that she was like in her product KPI weekly meeting, and they released a new feature, and they're now trying to understand how many active users are actually on the platform since they released that feature. So Maya came along and said that her report and her analysis shows 17,000 active users. And then another person on her team, the product manager, looked at her dashboards and she was like, wait, I have 27,000 active users, which is a very, very different number than what Maya has shown. And since we're all data people in the room, so I'm sure you're familiar with this. And by the way, this is something that people were talking about over and over also in Data Council right now. But the number 1 thing that we've been hearing is that when you give 2 data people the same business question, you usually get at least 2 different results, if not more. And of course, I see you guys all nodding. And of course, this is like a huge issue, right? Because that means that organizations can't rely on their data and that you can't really make like data-driven decisions. Now, this is a very kind of like high-level, kind of generic problem. And at Sherloq, we wanted to really dive deep and understand more specifically like why this is happening. And what we figured out is, of course, that the data process has a few different stages to it. And because in our past experience at Sherloq, so I was a product manager for several startups and enterprises, kind of building data products. And Nadav, my co-founder, he was himself a data analyst, and then a team lead of data analyst, and then a data exec. And he also dealt with data for many years on the analytics side. So we decided as a strategic move that we believe we can actually solve this problem best when it comes to the analytics part. But of course, this problem can happen in a few different parts in the data process. So at Sherloq, we really focus on the last part, which is actually creating the reports, writing the SQL, and creating that kind of part to it. And what we do at Sherloq, so we are building, you can think of it like ChatGPT and Copilot that's customized to any organization's internal database. Very simply put, probably what you're imagining at this point is that any person inside the organization, right, a salesperson, a product person, a data person, an engineer would come into our product. By the way, this is one of the first prototypes of our initial product that we tried to create. And they would just like ask this question on top of the data, and magically something would happen, and a very nice, cool chart would pop up and give like the correct answer. So for instance, if I would ask, like, how many active users do I have? Sherloq would be able to answer 7. That's I imagine what you're thinking. Now, unfortunately, life isn't that easy. And what we actually, at the beginning, we tried to create that product, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work for many reasons, but the main reason that we figured out is that data analytics is really, it comes down to the details, right? And let's take, for instance, the question of how many active users are on our platform. So this might be a SQL, one type of SQL that can be written to answer that question. Now, the data analyst or the data person that actually wrote the SQL needs to know a bunch of different things. So first of all, they would need to know what are the most relevant tables, fields, schemes that they actually need to use in order to create the most relevant SQL. Then they would not only need to know that, they would need to understand the structure of their database, their data lake, their data warehouse, whatever it is, understand how to connect them in the most correct way, efficient way, and that itself is an issue. Then they would need to know the best practices. So that means that today, I'm sure that you know it, there's a lot of tribal knowledge when it comes to data. A lot of people talk about it on Slack channels or have like some kind of documentation for this. So they would need to know all of that in order to create like the most correct SQL. Then they would need to know the logic on top of that. So they would need to know how that specific feature works or specific product works in order to create the SQL. And last but not least, they would also need to know how like the company even defines that high-level semantic active user term, right? Like semantic layers and stuff. So they would also need to know where that exists. So this is a big issue. It's very hard and very complicated to actually be able to generate SQL that's reliable and that a company can actually use. And this is a huge issue in organizations today. So what we've understood, and as data people ourselves, our key insight specifically at Sherloq, and kind of like the strategic move that we decided to take, was that we first of all need to create a product that actually learns and acts like a data person inside an organization. That basically means that we really need to know those very, very like low-level nuances when it comes to writing SQL, because different people, different teams, different features would write the SQL in a very different way. And unless we get that right, we won't actually be able to create a product that's in-depth enough, that gives true value. So that's kind of our key insight, and this will follow us throughout the 3 stages that I'm going to explain just in a second. So our first goal was actually to be able to create a product that generates answers for specifically data teams' questions about their internal structured database. In order for us, we took this part to prep the data for being able to generate the SQL itself, if that makes sense. But the main issue here is to be able to, first of all, answer questions that are regarding the metadata. So for instance, how to join between tables, what field or table do I need to use for a specific question or SQL? And if we get that right, then that's like the data prep that we need to do in order to, in a later stage, to actually be able to generate the SQL. This is also something that people were talking about a lot at Data Council, that in order for LLMs to actually work, data quality is a huge issue, and you need to actually prepare the data in a really like specific way. So this is our way of really getting that right and preparing the data in order to later on inject it on top of the LLM. Last thing before we go into the 3 stages. So the infrastructure behind our product, and this is relevant for each one of the stages. So what we actually do, we create metadata integrations on top of our customers' data warehouse, data lakes, visualization tools, BI tools. If they have any type of semantic layers, data catalogs, lineage tools, we also of course, take that into account. Then what we actually do, so we've built a proprietary component internally inside our product that we understand how each person inside the organization writes SQL, and that's something that later on, if you'd like, it's our secret sauce. We can talk about it later on in office hours. And we put that on top of a vector database, and that on top of an LLM. This is like pretty regular to these types of products. And that gives us the ability to actually answer the questions and create the most kind of relevant answers that we believe are correct. All right. So let's go into the 3 stages of how we actually built that first goal, that first kind of product. So what we actually did, the first stage, let's call it the magic stage, all right? What actually happened here was we built the infrastructure that I have just shown you, and we put that on top of the LLM, and we gave it to our users. So what actually happened, for instance, a data person would come and ask, what data do I need to use to understand an account's industry? And what we expected that would happen with that, on top of the data, the metadata that we injected into the LLM, it would be able to generate an answer like you see here on the screen. So it would be able to say the exact field because it has like the semantic context. It would be able to generate a description that we automatically generate based on the metadata that we injected. We would be able to give all of these kind of details, even give a SQL for example. And this is the first version that we've actually created, and this is what we thought would actually work. We were happy, right? We were like, yay, confetti, this is going to work. We saw ourselves like sitting on the yacht, drinking cocktails, watching the sunset. That's it. We have the product. Amazing, right? Of course, again, that's not how it works. And this turned out to be the very naive stage to the product. This is just one screenshot out of the many very annoying answers that the bot actually created, because, of course, it's not that simple. Even this like very kind of closed scope still didn't work in the first stage. And when it comes to the data itself, so you can see over here that when we launched the product, so this is a graph of the number of questions that have been asked week over week. And you can see that when we launched the product, as time went by, people asked less and less questions, and that just shows that when it comes to usage, they didn't really get value out of the first part here. And at some point, and that's that point, we understood that this isn't working. We need to stop. We need to understand what's wrong. And what we actually did, so YC rule number 1, right? We all know it, talk to your users. So we went and talked to our users, and we asked them, like, why isn't this working? And we basically got to 3 main conclusions. The first one is that the answers, like very straightforward, weren't just accurate. So we all know it, LLMs tend to bluff. Even if we did inject the relevant metadata and processed it in some kind of way, it still didn't give good enough answers. The second part was that there were too many types of questions. So this basically means that a lot of different types of people were asking questions on top of our chatbot. So data analysts, data engineers, data scientists, BI developers, you name it, any data person inside the organization would use our chatbot. And this, of course, are very different use cases, and each question needs to be dealt with differently. The second thing is that each person was expecting to see, each persona basically was expecting to see like a different result, right? So some were expecting to see the information itself, as I've shown. Others were expecting to see SQL. Others were expecting to see charts and graphs. So it really changed kind of the answer. And the last thing is that each person was had a different type of user flow, right? So that means that some of them were kind of in their daily process. Others were creating dashboards at that same second. And of course, when it comes to the jobs to be done framework in product management, it wasn't clear what's supposed to happen at this point. And the last part was that the outputs itself that we created weren't actually useful, right? So even here in this example, the data is correct. It essentially is the data that they're supposed to get. But as data people in the room, you can think to yourself, what am I supposed to do with this data? This isn't really helpful. And that was another part to it. So that gets us to stage number 2, the very aware of itself stage. This is like us understanding the pros. There are a lot of pros, but the cons of using this kind of technology and trying to actually create a version that takes into account the mistakes that we've created in the first stage. So what we did, at the first part when the answers weren't accurate, we created, other than changing and preparing the data a bit differently, what we actually did was that we created a user validation process. You can see here on the your right-hand side, something that we've done, like a very initial prototype that we had, that we are actually validating with our users what is the relevant table, for instance, that they are actually referring to. And that's one of the ways that we tried to validate the process before we actually generated the answer itself. When it comes to too many types of questions, so we needed to define an even smaller scope of users. And that essentially means that sometimes we would need to say no to different customers or users because we cannot right now give them the things that they actually need. So other than creating a closed scope, we would actually define the use cases themselves. So over here you can see different types of use cases and questions that we have defined that we can support from this part of the product and onwards. And that really enabled us to create also outputs that are relevant for each type of question that has been being asked, right? And we can ensure right now that the user flow is very, very clear. The output actually gives value to our users, and that our users can do something with the information that we are giving them right now. And happily enough, you can see that the graph, once we did these changes, the number of questions went back up. And this was a good starting point. We were like, okay, people are now starting to ask questions, which is good, right? It's so good that we should do confetti. And we were like, yay, this is working. Again, we can party. We see the sunset. We're drinking the cocktails. All of that same story again. We're happy with our life. And like, yeah, we can go home right now. But of course, no, that's not how it happens. And the main issue here was that now it's very cool that people are using. But the real question when you're building a product is, do you actually give value to your users? Like, what's the real value here, right? And we went back to our users that were using, and we asked them the same question that the problem, going back to the problem, we went back to that. And we asked them again, how many active users do you have on your platform, or any type of question to see that the data is actually aligned. Of course, what we thought we were going to get is like the same number. But what we actually got was definitely not the same number. And I can't explain to you enough, and people here that are building stuff, or like product managers, or anyone here in the room that faces this is like the most annoying thing, because you're like, people are using, but it's not giving them real value. And that's annoying. And again, we went and talked to our customers. And what we've understood, and we heard over and over again, were that people, our like data analysts, were telling us that the word like, I didn't know I'm supposed to ask the question, or I wasn't familiar with the field that wasn't updated correctly. And this like I didn't know part brought us to understand, to use this type of framework, the unknown type of framework, which we can look at it pretty simply like this. So the knowns and the known knowns are the questions that our users know the answers to, right? So this isn't a use case that's relevant for Sherlock. The second one are the known unknowns, which means it's the questions that our users don't know the answer to, but know that they need to ask someone, right? So they would go to our chatbot and use it, and that's exactly what the chatbot is intended for. And the last part is the unknowns. These types of questions are those questions that they don't even know that they're supposed to ask. So for instance, you can think about a few different use cases, and we'll go into that in a second, of questions that you don't even know that you're supposed to use and you're supposed to ask one another. And this is the part that we were trying to solve in stage number 3 of our product. We called it dealing with the unknowns. And the concept here was that basically what happens is that when people write SQL, the SQL itself, behind the SQL itself, there are questions that our users are asking without actually asking them. So let's take this SQL, for example. What you can actually see here is that when someone writes this type of SQL, he's basically asking, when you decide to use a specific field, what you're actually asking here in this type of field is like, is this the most updated field that I'm actually supposed to use? Is this the real field that I'm supposed to? Is there another field that I'm supposed to use that isn't this field? When I'm writing this where clause, what I'm actually trying to ask is this the real way that I'm supposed to filter the data? Is this the logic that I'm supposed to use? Is there any type of different logic that I'm supposed to use that isn't this one? And the SQL itself, behind the SQL, there are a lot of different types of questions that people are actually asking. So what we did overall, in our users' query editors, as they were typing their SQL, we would try to understand what they are meaning, right? What are they actually trying to ask? This sounds like sci-fi, like we're trying to read their minds, but basically no, it's very much like in the SQL itself, right? So that basically means that when someone's using a specific field, we would now know how to pop up a suggestion. This is like a co-pilot kind of understanding, right? But we would know how to pop up a suggestion that would show and would tell them that they do or don't need to use that field. A field is just one example, but of course there are tons of different other examples. And this approach is kind of like the very proactive way of trying to create that alignment and to create that one source, one place of using the most relevant data. Going back to the ChatGPT and generating SQL, this approach was what actually helped us afterwards create that ability to generate customized SQL for our users, right? Because once we have this right, and once we really understand how our users are writing their SQL, this then is the base, and these are the data sources that we later on use to generate SQL that's customized per person, per team, per organization. This is kind of like what enabled us later on to create that more extensive product, the product itself. And when we go back to kind of proving that we are creating value to our users, so what we've actually created is what we call like the alignment calculator. So for each type of suggestion, we would actually look at the SQL that was supposed to use this suggestion before Sherlock was in the organization and after Sherlock was in the organization. And we would see how many SQLs actually use that type of suggestion before and after. And what you can actually see here, for instance, is that on average, we were able to increase the number of queries that use our suggestions by 36%. So this is like a good place to start. Of course, we want it to be more, but this is like one way for us to show our customers that we are creating this alignment, we're creating the ROI that we sold to them and we said that we actually have. So this time, it was a small confetti, not a very big one, and it will be related to the closing thoughts that we have that I'll share just in a second. But the small confetti is like our way to show that yes, we were able to create like a cool feature here or a cool product when it came to the Copilot. But this is just one building block on top of like the next versions of our product. And there's a learning curve when it comes to building products and building data products specifically. Two last thoughts before we close up here. So what actually really helped us while building this product was the ability to monitor our users' usage on the go. So other than having like those dashboards that you see over time how people use the product, we actually had a Slack channel that each time someone asked a question or used our question in some type of way, we would get like this notification of the whole organization, the whole team basically would get this notification that someone asked the question. We would have this internal SLA of 10 minutes. So that means that in 10 minutes after someone asks a question, we would need to then understand if we gave them the most relevant answer that we could give them. And if we didn't give that answer, we would then follow up on Slack or like on some kind of messaging app and give them the most correct answer. That means that we had like 24/7 support. But the more important thing is that we were very, very quickly able to understand if our product actually works, right? And very, very quickly create those iterations and develop the features in a way that gave value to our users. The second part, and these are the last three thoughts on this process. So the first thing is that when it comes to like generative AI and LLMs, it's an amazing tool, right? But it's just a tool. It's not the product itself. It's not that's not the reason to build a company. The real reason to probably build a company is to find a problem and really want to be able to solve it. The LLMs are a great way to do it. They open up a lot of different capabilities, but it's definitely not the product itself, and it's something that we learned from the naive kind of stage. The second part is that it's probably best when launching like a new product or a new feature for kind of like larger enterprises, is that it's better to start with just one use case. That means that, of course, you get to less users over time, but that means that you're able to actually solve a problem. So it's better to go in-depth than like scattered, in our opinion, when it comes to building products. And the last thing, so this is a funny story. We like to call it the start prepping the servers approach. So before we actually launched our first product, one of us said that they're afraid that the servers wouldn't be up for all the like crazy traction that we're supposed to get from the questions that people are going to ask. Of course, as you signed the graphs, it took time until we had traction, and it took time until the servers really needed to do something. So the kind of lesson here is, first of all, to be as modest and humble as possible when it comes to building new stuff. And the second thing is that there's a learning curve, and when you're building like new technology, and new products, we need to take that into account, and we need to understand that it takes time, and take deep breaths. But at the end, if you're ambitious enough, I think you'll get it right. By the way, we're still building, right? So we still haven't got it correctly, but we're on a good path, and hopefully we will keep building and building and building for more end users and more customers as we go along. Thank you so much. It was really great to be here and meet you all. Super happy afterwards to answer any other questions over here in office hours. And feel free to reach out also on LinkedIn afterwards. I'd love to stay in touch. So thank you so much for your time.